So, our final group that we're going to be talking about and their fight for civil rights is going to be the LGBT community, and this is known as the Gay Liberation Movement. So, before that we get into exactly um, how the movement starts, it's really important that you understand the various groups that are going to be involved in this particular movement and are also involved in this movement today, largely because this is probably going to be the most prevalent civil rights fight that you will see in your lifetime. And so it's important for you to be well educated on who is part of what group and how the group has been formulated and its history, so that you can better understand kind of where the conflict exists today. So, first thing you need to have is the proper nomenclature. So most people are familiar with LGBT, but it's actually a much larger community than just those four letters. It actually is LGBTQIA. And the various letters stand for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual. So just as a quick rundown for those of you guys who are maybe not so familiar with this terminology. Lesbian is two females who are sexually attracted to each other. So a great example of this would be Ellen DeGeneres and her wife Portia de Rossi. Gay are two males who are sexually attracted to each other. So my personal favorites are Neil Patrick Harris and his amazing and adorable family. Then you have bisexual, who is a male or female who is sexually attracted to male or female. So essentially, that there is not a definition between or not a preference of one gender versus the other. Transgender is probably the one that has been in the news most frequently in the last couple of years, and you are probably all familiar with the transformation of Caitlyn Jenner, formerly Bruce Jenner, and she made the decision to have sexual reassignment surgery to become female to match her gender identity. So transgender is actually a much broader term than most people actually believe. Transgender is not just someone like Caitlyn Jenner who has made the decision to have sexual reassignment surgery to physically become the other gender, but rather transgender is a broad definition that is anyone who does not identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. And this can be everything from those that feel that don't feel like they identify with that gender but might still dress like that gender. Sometimes it's somebody who is was born female but dresses and acts and lives as a male but doesn't have necessarily the sexual reassignment surgery. However, transgender also includes people who are gender non-conforming, gender fluid, and non-gendered. So gender non-conforming and non-gendered are two terms that you can essentially use for individuals who are who basically deny that there has to be either or, that you have to be female or you have to be male. Gender nonconforming or agendered can potentially be, or non-gendered, can be somebody who actually prefers to promote and live as both genders simultaneously, or as neither gender and be truly agendered. The other one is gender fluid, somebody who is whose identity kind of changes day by day. So a great example of this is Ruby Rose. For those of you guys who are fans of the show Orange is the New Black. Sometimes you see her and she is dressed incredibly feminine, and she has feminine makeup and she has a feminine stance and she exudes femininity. And then in other times you will see her and she is dressed very masculinely, that even if she's wearing makeup, she's still wearing very masculine makeup, that she exudes, this masculine aura. And it is because she is gender fluid, that her identity of being female or being male changes kind of on a daily basis. And so, so you see her very much play with this, what we call androgyny, of not fully male, not fully female. And that androgyny is something that has been very prevalent in the LGBT community and in artistic communities for a long time, which I'll talk more about in just a couple of minutes. Next, we have queer. Now, this originally was a term that was utilized to describe people that were LGBT because they didn't really have a name for it, and also it was illegal to be homosexual, and so they would use this term queer. Why? Because queer means a little different, a little strange. However, it started to be used in a very negative way and be used as a derogatory statement. But the LGBT community has decided in the last kind of few years that they want to take that term back. And they use it very much as this kind of large umbrella term for anybody that is of an alternative sexual orientation or an alternative gender identity that does not necessarily either want to identify as one of these others or is somebody who maybe doesn't fit into one of these other categories. So an example would be somebody who is a male crossdresser, a straight man, so a man who is sexually attracted to women who likes to wear women's clothing. That would be somebody who is described as queer. We also have people like Miley Cyrus, who essentially says that she does not want to put a label on her sexuality. And so the fact that she is has had relationships with both men and women, typically people would label her as bisexual. However, she does not like to label that sexuality, and so she just describes herself as queer. The next one is intersex, and this is one that has also a very difficult history with it, as well as many of these other groups. Intersex is one that is very hard for a lot of people to understand. Intersex is somebody who is physically born with both genders. Typically, it is somebody who is born predominantly with one gender over the other, but still has the reproductive hormones or the reproductive physical attributes of both genders. So this particular individual, her name is Hannah Gabby O'Deal, and she is a model from Belgium, and she has recently come out as being intersex. Now, the former term for this is hermaphrodite, and that term is incredibly offensive within the community because, and it's understandable where the term came from. People were trying to understand where this community is from and like how to describe them. So they looked for something that they already understood. And a hermaphrodite is a plant that is able to self-pollinate. So in plants, you need a male plant and a female plant in order to produce, flowers and produce fruits. And the problem is that when you call a person a hermaphrodite, you're essentially saying that, like a plant that can self-pollinate, you're essentially saying that these people can self-impregnate themselves, which is absolutely not only biologically inaccurate, but it's also highly offensive. And so that is why the term and the nomenclature has been changed to intersex. And in the last few years, it has started to become more acceptable for intersex individuals to choose to maintain their intersexuality, intersexual identity. That typically what has happened in the past is that you are going to be born intersex and your parents decide whether they are going to have you be a male or a female, and so those other organs are going to be removed and that you will be on hormone replacement therapy so that you become fully that one gender versus the other. And so because of this, now we're seeing that individuals that are of the intersex community are deciding to actually embrace um, their natural state and to maintain um, the basically the sexual organs and the sexual hormones that they were born with. The final one, and this is one that is many times difficult for teenagers to understand, is asexual, which are individuals who are not sexually attracted to anyone, which is many times hard for hormonal teenagers to comprehend. But asexual individuals are people who are not sexually attracted to anyone, and it does not mean that they cannot have relationships or even get married or even have children. It's just that sex does not, um, it doesn't interest them. And two great examples of this would be Tim Gunn, who's famous from telling us to make it work on Project Runway, and the comedian Janine Garofalo. Both of them have come out to say that, you know, that while, relationships are good and they love having a companion and they love having someone that they can love, intimacy sexually is not necessarily important to them. So this is the community that we are going to see start to fight for its civil rights in the late 1960s. The history, however, is a lot more wide and a lot more varied. In Native American history, for example, people of the LGBT community were revered because they were of what the Native Americans called the third soul, that they weren't fully male or fully female. They were somewhere in between, and in many ways, Native Americans saw this as essentially two souls that had combined into one. So they were twice as soulful as anybody else. And because of this, they were special, almost magical. And they were given highly regarded positions within the tribe, that they were shamans, they were medicine men, they were leaders of the tribes. And then the Puritans show up. And that practice very quickly is going to end because, as you might guess, Puritans are not quite so open to this idea of alternative sexual orientations. Um, and so that's going to be the tradition in America for a very long time. However, in the 1920s, we see the rise of this group called the Bohemians, who are very artistic and very open-minded. And they are going to be open to the LGBT community, that they don't care if somebody is lesbian or gay or bisexual, or even people who live androgynously, kind of the beginning of transgender people kind of coming into the public knowledge. Um, and so that's acceptable within this very kind of out there and liberal grouping during the 1920s. In the 1920s, however, we also have the issue of eugenics. And eugenics is going to encourage people to, be these perfect little Americans. And, you need to be white and you need to be Protestant and you need to be intelligent and you need to be this, that, and the other. So clearly, LGBT individuals are not going to be accepted into that eugenicism. And so there is going to be a lashing out against the LGBT plus community because they are seen as imperfect. However, by the time that we get to the 1950s, the Beat generation is going to be very welcoming of the LGBT community. Again, not really caring if you're gay, straight, or somewhere in between, as well as that they, because of this liberalism and being artistic, they were very open and welcoming to these individuals. And by the time we get to the 1960s and we see the counterculture movement begin, people being more open than they were before was starting to become more acceptable. And we see that through history, many LGBT plus individuals have existed and been prominent. However, they have many times and most of the time been closeted because it was frowned upon or illegal during that time frame. So these are just some great examples of individuals that fit into that mold. James Buchanan, the President of the United States, was gay. We know that as historians, not because he came out of the closet and said, "Hey, everybody, look, I'm gay," because that would not have happened in the 1850s, but rather because he had a lifelong, quote unquote, roommate and very close friend that he lived with for like 25 years. They went everywhere together, they celebrated every holiday together, they essentially lived as a couple. And despite the fact that it was never spoken of directly because that was illegal and morally frowned upon at the time, their close friends and family understood their situation and accepted them as a traditional couple. We also see individuals like J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, who, based on most historians' understanding, was actually a secret cross-dresser, that he was a straight man who enjoyed wearing women's clothing. And even our school's namesake, Eleanor Roosevelt, was bisexual. While she did marry FDR because they were in love, it quickly became clear that A, he had a wandering eye, and B, they really didn't have that much in common. They were good friends, and they were a fantastic political relationship, but as far as romantic, it didn't really last. They did have children, but by the time that they entered into the White House and Eleanor discovering that FDR had been having an affair with her secretary, she moved out of the White House and she moved down the street into a house where she lived with many of the women that she had worked on the women's suffrage movement with. And there was one woman in particular that was living at that house that she had an incredibly close relationship with, spent most of her time with, and based on letters that they wrote to each other, it was clear that there was more than just a friendship that was there, that there was actually a romantic relationship between the two of them. And like I said, most of these individuals throughout history did not come out into the public about their sexual orientation, largely because it was frowned upon and in some cases illegal, that they could be imprisoned and in some cases killed for just admitting their sexual orientation. And so that is why it's going to be so important for this movement as it begins. So it all starts on June 27th, 1969 in New York's Greenwich Village. And on that night, something unremarkable occurred. The police raided a gay bar. But that night, the patrons of the bar did something that would change history. They fought back. Now, the folks that you see in the picture here are patrons of a bar called the Stonewall Inn, which was a de facto gay bar. And why I say that is because there was no such thing as an actual legitimate gay bar, because that was illegal. Being homosexual in New York was illegal. And so these individuals just kind of started to congregate at these bars, and they became gay bars. The police went in, raided the place, as they did many of these gay bars on a regular basis. However, the violence within the gay bar started to spill out onto the street, and Greenwich Village, being a very gay-friendly and artistic neighborhood, gathered a large crowd, and it started a riot. And there was a lot of violence and brutalization on behalf of the police, that they were punching people and beating them with batons and sending people off to the hospital. The very next night, the same thing happened. The police raided the gay bar. It started spilling out onto the streets. People started to get involved. It started a riot. People were beaten, sent to the hospital. It happened again several nights later. And after this third riot, the gay community realized that they needed to band together to protect themselves as well as protecting each other. And so here's an image that you see of two police officers and another man who are pushing these members from the Stonewall Inn back. Stonewall Inn was not a prominent place even within the gay community. It was where even the most marginalized within the gay community would go and congregate. It was very young homosexual men, homeless youth, drag queens, which are gay men who dress in women's clothing. And so these people who had been ignored by their own community because of the brutalization that they had faced at the hands of the police, it really brought the community together of we need to protect ourselves and we need to protect each other. And so 1 year later, they would hold the very first gay pride parades in Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago as kind of a memory of the anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And we see them marching in the streets and openly professing their homosexuality, which in and of itself was an illegal act. The Gay Liberation Front would start to coalesce, and this particular group was urging people of the LGBT community to come out of the closet and reveal their sexuality to their friends and their family and their colleagues. And this was to be a form of activism and counter the shame that they had received in society. And so every year in October, there is a National Coming Out Day as a continuation of this event. And one of the people that made this organization and made this movement really prominent and was kind of one of the leading figures is a man by the name of Harvey Milk. Something that might be difficult for people to wrap their head around is the fact that at one time, San Francisco was very much not gay friendly, which is hard to imagine because most of us think like if there's going to be a place where it's great to be gay, it would be San Francisco. But that wasn't the case. San Francisco actually had these really strict laws that allowed for people to discriminate against gay people. Harvey Milk, despite the fact that he had really like no real government experience, ran for city council, and he was the first openly gay person to be elected to public office in California and one of the very first across the nation. He's going to become like the spokesperson for the gay community in San Francisco, in California, and really as the nation overall. And he's able to get a very strict gay rights ordinance passed in San Francisco that outlawed discrimination based on sexual orientation. At this point, prior to this ordinance, LGBT individuals could be denied jobs, they could be fired from their jobs if they revealed that they were gay, they could be evicted from their apartments, or denied the ability to rent an apartment, to get a business license, all kinds of things just based on their sexual orientation. And so this was really important, and he became this central figure in the LGBT community. And at one of his speeches that was kind of rallying the community, he said, "On this anniversary of Stonewall, I ask my gay sisters and brothers to make the commitment to fight for themselves, for their freedom, for their country. We will not win our rights by staying quietly in our closets. We are coming out to fight the lies, the myths, the distortions. We're coming out to tell the truth about gays, for I am tired of the conspiracy of silence. So I'm going to talk about it. And I want you to talk about it. You must come out. Come out to your parents, your relatives." And he got a lot of negative attention for this, not from the gay community, but from the straight community who was fearful of this gay liberation. And he got a lot of death threats. However, his very young death would actually not come at the hand of somebody that was homophobic, but rather by another city supervisor who had quit largely because he didn't like partially all the attention that Harvey Milk was getting, but also because he had resigned because there was a job that he didn't really want to do, and Harvey Milk was like, "Yeah, I'll do it." And next thing you know, Harvey Milk's getting all this, a kind of applause for this thing that this other guy didn't want to do. He wanted to get his job back, and the city council wouldn't let him. And so he went into the city hall and he assassinated the mayor and Harvey Milk. And the death of Harvey Milk was devastating for the gay community because they did not have a leader. And it did start to fall apart a little bit because they didn't have somebody that that could kind of bring everybody together, and that was the central figure. But there was one other thing that was starting to destroy the gay community, and that was AIDS. AIDS started to come into the United States in the early 1970s, and the problem with it is that it very quickly started to spread, and it was devastating to those that had contracted this disease. They were dying within months or even weeks of contracting the disease. Doctors had no idea what it was, did not know how to treat it, did not know how to stop it. And so they at least were trying to figure out, well, where is this thing coming from? And what they started to discover was that it tended to be affecting one group in particular, and that was homosexual men. And so they gave it the name gay cancer. And that was the name that it was referred to as until 1982, when it was renamed by the Centers for Disease Control as the AIDS or HIV syndrome. And that tells you a lot about our view of the LGBT community at that time, that we call this gay cancer as it being something that not only affects only gay people, and that it somehow has something to do with them being gay and their behavior, but also by many people, it was seen as a punishment for being gay. This is what you get for having this alternative lifestyle. However, people over time do start to change their views on the gay community because of HIV and AIDS. And it's because of these individual people. The first of these is David Kirby. David Kirby was not only a gay rights activist, but also an HIV and AIDS activist, because he himself not only was affected by this by losing friends because of the disease, but he also contracted the disease. And he had these massive rallies and speeches where he talked about HIV and AIDS, but he also had a journalist that followed him kind of as he went town to town talking about this. As he himself began to waste away because of AIDS, he asked this journalist to join him and his family on his deathbed. And he had this particular photograph taken, and she posted it in Life magazine. And suddenly, gay cancer became a real disease that affected real families and that had truly horrific results on the individual that had contracted the disease. And people started to feel like that this was something that needed to be researched, that it was not something that anybody deserved to get. That was also fostered and furthered, those feelings were fostered and furthered with Ryan White. Ryan White was a teenage kid who lived in a tiny little town called Kokomo, Indiana. He was a hemophiliac, which meant that his blood didn't clot, and so he had constant blood transfusions that he had to get. And one of these blood transfusions that he received had been HIV positive. And so Ryan White, at 13 years old, is now given essentially a year-long life expectancy. And he was expected to die very quickly because there wasn't really any research, there wasn't really any medicines or anything like that into preventing or treating AIDS. And so this teenage kid who, other than this disease that he has now contracted, is your average, normal, middle-class American kid. And he became the spokesperson for this movement, that this is not something that just affects the gay community. It affects everybody, and anybody can get it. And when this affected a kid, Americans really started to take note, and that they felt that there needed to be greater education. Ryan White, when he tried to return to school, parents pulled their kids out of class because they thought that they could get this disease simply by sitting next to him in class. And so clearly education needed to happen. Clearly research needed to happen. And so that starts to become part of the conversation. And it really reaches its height of people wanting something to be done when Magic Johnson comes out and admits that he has acquired HIV. And when this amazing pro athlete who is at the height of his career is diagnosed with this deadly disease, the entire nation realizes that this is something that could affect anybody and that it is something that needs to be paid attention to. Ryan White was lucky to live 5 years longer than predicted. He actually lived all the way up until 1 month before his high school graduation. Magic Johnson is still around and still doing great, largely due to the research that was put into HIV and AIDS. And we did see that this started to affect a larger audience, and so there was more attention to this disease, but also to the gay community as a whole. One other thing that started in the mid 1990s was an organization called GLSEN creating the Day of Silence. GLSEN is the Gay and Lesbian Straight Education Network, and it is an organization for students where they are promoting education and also support for gay and lesbian students. The Day of Silence is a day of action every single year in which students take a vow of silence in order to illustrate how the silencing effect of homophobic speech, as well as homophobia itself, upon the gay and lesbian community. This actually was just the other day, on Friday, April 21st, and students on our own campus were taking this vow of silence to show support for their gay and lesbian friends and family members who have been silenced or who have felt silenced because of anti-LGBT bullying or homophobia. So last but certainly not least is going to be on the environmentalist movement. And this all begins with this woman right here. This is Rachel Carson. She wrote a book called Silent Spring in 1962. And she was researching the effects of pesticides, specifically one, DDT, that was being used on America's farmlands. And what she was discovering is that this was, yes, killing the bugs, but what was happening is that the bugs were being eaten by birds. And so now these birds were having the effects of these pesticides on their bodies, and we were seeing that it was killing birds, not just killing them outright, but killing the next generation, where their eggshells were so thin that the baby birds would never fully form, and thus there would be a silent spring, that you wouldn't hear the sounds of baby birds being born during the springtime. And it shows the poisonous effects of pesticides and showed how dangerous our use of pesticides was on the animal kingdom, but also on ourselves. And in the next few years, we are going to see that there is going to be a growth of environmentalism as a result of our increased industrialization and see the negative effects that it has on us and our environment. In 1963, so just 1 year after Silent Spring is created, we passed the Clean Air Act, which was designed to drop the amount of poisonous and pollutants, poisonous chemicals and pollutants in our atmosphere. And this has done an immense amount of work to help create a safer environment for all of us to live in. That there is less pollution. Here in California, with the vast amount of cars that we have, it was smoggy all the time. And the Clean Air Act is what requires us to get smog checks on our cars and for us to have breathable air. And so this has very dramatically reduced the amount of pollutants in the air. However, it has not stopped it completely by any means. We also have in 1970 the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. And this organization was created in order to ensure that we were protecting our environment, and it was a federal organization who oversaw that and helped create laws that would foster the protection of our environment. In 1970, we also have the very first Earth Day. Earth Day is held on April 22nd every single year and is celebrated by over 190 countries around the world. Earth Day was founded by a U.S. Senator by the name of Gaylord Nelson, And it was supposed to be an environmental teach-in. So teachers would put aside their traditional curriculum, and for one day they would focus on environmentalism and the effects of our behavior on our environment. And this first one was held on April 22nd, 1970, and so every single year it is on April 22nd as a reminder of the original Earth Day. It was extremely successful and has been a day that has been used by environmentalists as a day of awareness, education, and also protest in order to draw attention to consistent and continuing issues with environmentalism that we still have today. And finally, we have the Endangered Species Act. In 1973, we realized that we were seeing a vast number of animals around the world that were starting to be we're starting to see not only a drop in their populations, but in some cases, almost their near extinction. And so we've had a huge number of animals that have been on the Endangered Species Act, and some of them, because of the policies created under the Endangered Species Act that helped protect their environments or created systems where we were protecting their habitats or changing our behaviors in order to help promote safer and better living conditions for these animals, we have seen some animals be taken off the endangered species list. For me, one of my absolute all-time favorite animals, the American manatee, has been recently taken off the endangered species list because of protection of their environment, but also by efforts to increase their population through breeding. And so this is going to be an effect of us taking the ideas of civil rights, of protections for all Americans, and applying these things to also the environments that allows for Americans to survive. It's also very much inspired by the counterculture movement that was very much in favor and supportive of environmentalism. And so it's taking all of these events that happened before it and kind of bringing them together. So that's it for social upheaval, and we will be finishing up this unit in our next classes.